What is going on, everybody, here? And I want to spend some time tonight talking about Lorwyn. So the sales have been absolutely insane, and the commander decks seem like they have such pent-up demand. And obviously, I've talked in a prior video this week about just the expected value of the commander decks and the fact that I think there's a lot of pent-up demand because we didn't have commander decks for Avatar, we didn't have them for Spider-Man. We did have them for Edge, but Final Fantasy, we got them, then we got them again, then we got them again. And I think everybody was pretty much ready for something new. And we finally got that one. So what I wanted to do, I like to take a look at what the sell-through rate is of these items as they go into release and kind of compare them to what past sets were. So I want to go through this. It's really Tarkir, Aether Drift, Edge, Final Fantasy Collector I threw in because I was doing the work. I figured it was just kind of interesting. And then Lorwyn. But before we get started, and I will talk through the logic, it's really an attempt to look at the number of displays. So sealed cases. So for Aether Drift, it's 2 of each deck. Tarkir, it's 5 decks in a larger box. Edge Eternity's 2 of each. Lorwyn, 2 of each. Final Fantasy 4. Final Fantasy Collector 4 with the Surge Foils. The special one for I ignored. Quite honestly, it's just a reskin, an outlier in the data set, so it's not even worth talking about. And then we have, obviously, this is from TCG Player, and this is displays. This is the 2 deck. So for whatever reason, Aether Drift did not sell sealed displays. At least I couldn't find the listing. So we'd have the 2 decks individually. The same for Edge, and then the same for Lorwyn. And for whatever reason, people tend to not buy the sealed displays, which again is 2 of each deck on TCG Player, which is, I guess it makes sense. I guess people are really buying them to break for singles. If you're buying the decks to play, you probably don't need 2 copies of them. So we have the displays. We have 2 decks, or the 2 deck listings. We have the top deck. So for example, now obviously there's going to be a little bit of crossover over periods of time because this is not in a vacuum. This is all of the sales in the last year from the graph on TCG Player, which is super, super helpful. But for example, if here there's probably a little bit of overlap because it's possible that somebody could have bought 2 decks and then sold one of them. Chances are they probably didn't sell the best deck because that's most likely what they bought it for. But there is a little bit of potential noise in the data. Now with Tarkir, 4,200 displays sold, obviously no 2 decks. And then the top individual deck sold 3,386 copies. Again, there could be a little bit of overlap, but this is really an attempt to, in broad strokes, estimate how many displays have moved in the overall market. Now we go to singles. I probably went through 6 or 7 of the best-selling singles. Kind of tried to ballpark the ones that were pretty hot. Obviously, kept the Soul Rings, things like that out because they're in multiple decks. Don't make a whole lot of sense. So this is a top-selling single that is in just 1 deck. Again, there might be 1 or 2 that are outliers here, which was interesting with Final Fantasy Collector. Like the top 10 cards all have between like 420 and 428 sold, which is really interesting. And then we have the total here. And I'm going to get into the math in a second because there are some assumptions, especially as we get to the implied burn rate. But I want to talk about allocation on release. And this is just my experience with my distributors based on what my orders were. And, obviously the world's changed pretty substantially in the last year, especially with the way that Wizards of the Coast is looking at things. But Aether Drift, the commander decks were very, very heavily allocated. We were coming out of a slow period of time. And we had the cases that had 2 of each deck. So they're heavily allocated. And, in my view, there wasn't a whole lot of product out there. Now, Tarkir was also heavily allocated, but there were 5 decks. So in my view, there was a much larger amount of displays printed. And I'm just speaking logically here, so ignore column G for now, which kind of proves the point. Edge, same thing. Now, these were, they weren't as heavily allocated as Aether Drift, a little bit more moderate. But again, it's 2 of each deck. Final Fantasy commander decks, they were allocated, but they weren't super heavily allocated. I think we got like 75% of what we looked for or asked for. Final Fantasy collectors were super heavily allocated. I think we got like 13. We got a handful from each distributor, and then from our WPN, we got a decent chunk. But these are super heavily allocated, and it also turns out that WotC held a lot of these back to try to sell on Amazon. Different conversation. And then Lorwyn, we got everything we asked for and then some. So very little allocation. And it does seem like the total quantity of Lorwyn Commander displays has increased substantially over what we've seen in the past. Obviously, Wizards have a relatively low bar for earnings in Q1 because Q1 last year was Innistrad Remastered and Aether Drift, which were two sets that didn't perform. Well, I shouldn't say didn't perform well. It relates to the rest of the sets on here. They performed poorly, but they weren't bad sets per se. So as we get into this, what I did was, so for the total amount of burn, I took the total sum of these, and then I backed out 50% of the 2 decks, because if we're trying to take this to displays themselves, we have to back out half of the 2 decks, because obviously two 2-deck sets is 1 display. And then the top deck, same thing. Again, just kind of tried to back it into what a display would be. But then the singles, this is obviously the value, because obviously if somebody's selling the single and delivering that single, they have broke it at least 1 deck, 1 display set. In fact, we could probably argue, let me change that, because I do want to change. I do think we need to back this out as well. And again, I'm just kind of walking through the logic with you guys live here, because I was thinking through that. There's nothing here. So feel free to add to this in the comment section, because again, this is just kind of logic. So again, if we're 50% of all of these makes a lot of sense. 100% of all these, because there's no duplicates, and you're 50% of these 3, but you are counting 100% of these, and the same with Lorwyn. So when I did the implied burn rate, based on all of the calculations I've ever done with TCG Player, where I see purchase orders from distributors, and I'm able to, with a reasonable level of, I guess, I don't want to say certainty, because that's never the case, but with a reasonable level of an idea of how much is actually in the market, I can kind of look at TCG Player, and generally speaking, the volume of product, and this is really for Pokemon Magic, I really don't look at this with anything else, is between 1.5% to 3% of the overall market. But with Commander decks and the number of folks that are selling Commander singles and the folks that are buying and selling decks, you obviously have other competitors. You have, Card Trader, Mana Pool, Card Market, which is mostly Europe. I'm sure there's some others out there, but TCG Player owns a lot of the population. eBay, obviously. So for this, just because it felt right, given what I know went to distribution, 5% of the total market kind of made sense. At 2.5%, the number seemed just way too high for me. Because again, 0.25 to 5%, obviously double the number. So again, this is just gut feel based on my experience with TCG Player, and as it pertains to the overall market. You may disagree, you may not disagree, but Aether Drift, for example, I think the large distributors probably got somewhere around 18 to 20,000 of these displays, and that's your Southerns, your PhDs, GTS a little bit less than that, Magazine Exchange a little bit less, Alliance I think is a little bit less. I have a little bit less visibility into Alliance and Magazine Exchange. Alliance, really just because it's been a little bit messy with Chapter 11. Which they're through, and look, they're doing fine. They just did their cut over with Universal, and look, hopefully everything works out for them, and it's great. But moving on to Tarkir, about 257,000 of these, and keep in mind, Aether Drift, Edge of Eternities, Tarkir, Final Fantasy have all had reprints in the market. Aether Drift and Edge of Eternities are fully stocked in distribution. Tarkir is basically sold out everywhere except for Magazine Exchange. And the good part about MagX is it's a double-edged sword. So they give you a whole lot of product unless you're WPN when the reprints come out, but they do keep the product on the shelves for a much longer amount of time. Now, granted, it's a little bit above what you would normally pay for distribution, but they have it available and it can be had, which is a nice little bonus. So with Tarkir being almost gone, there is a higher degree of burn with Tarkir, whereas I'm really not trying to add how many of these are distribution, but Aether Drift versus Edge of Eternities being approximately the same amount of burn makes a lot of sense to me because Aether Drift came out in, I think it was February, and Edge of Eternities was an August set. So you're basically, 5 months? 5 months less of Edge of Eternities versus Aether Drift out there. And Aether Drift actually has a lot of a very positive EV. I think the last I checked, the Commander deck EV itself was 170, plus the CSPs are like, I don't know, $5, $6, $7 each. So you're probably sitting right around 190 for something. I think distro price of those was like 108, 107. This was a couple distro / WotC price raises ago. So Aether Drift would have sold reasonably well just because of that. Tarkir, Tarkir's probably my favorite set, quite honestly. It's really, really cool. I think it's going to age well. Edge of Eternities, again, it's about the same. But moving to Final Fantasy, and this is where it's interesting. So using the same math and the same assumptions, this puts us at about 362,000 in implied maximum burn. And I think, or the total amount of units. Now, there's obviously a ton of these distribution stuff. So I'm sure there's probably 50,000 at distribution across the board, maybe 40,000 at this point. And it's slowly starting to dry up at some places, but this number inherently makes sense. And it makes sense because Tarkir is completely sold out. It's been sold out for a couple weeks now. And Final Fantasy, there's just so much out there. And the other piece with this is with Final Fantasy, the difference I don't know is what percentage of the total population went to Amazon. So for example, if we say Final Fantasy, a much larger percentage of Final Fantasy went through Amazon than everybody else, that would have obviously made a lot of sense. We changed this number to 4%. Now all of a sudden, you're going from 360 to 450. So the sensitivity in the overall analysis, when you get to large numbers, is astronomical. And quite honestly, I would be shocked if there aren't well over 500,000 Final Fantasy Commander displays printed. So it's kind of interesting. Final Fantasy collectors, I do want to touch on this for a little bit because these are really starting to dry up. The last couple items under $500 from eBay on. So top deck is Scions. It's either the Terra deck or the Scions and Spellcraft deck. I don't remember. The top single at 428. I think a lot of folks are going to start breaking these for singles because the EV across all of the decks and the CSPs in Final Fantasy are still like $16, $17, which is crazy. It's somewhere around $900. So if you can buy the decks for $500, there is some money to be made. And I would expect that the surge foils at some point in time are going to appreciate value. I do think at some point, probably by the end of next year, these Final Fantasy collector commanders, they're going to be pushing $1,000. And at some point we'll laugh because they're going to be valued at a good amount more than the Warhammer ones, which are like $1,000 right now. So implied max burn rate 52,000. This is probably a little light as well because we know they sold a ton of these. They sold a ton of these at Amazon. So even if we assume 4% or 3%, we're probably 75,000. In reality, there's probably 100,000 of these to 125,000 of these in print. Best case scenario. But that brings us to Lorwyn, and the whole purpose of this lead up was to talk about Lorwyn. And with the math here that we've just gone through, and I don't have to change it because I didn't even look at the single sales because everything just went out for pre-release. nothing is sold. Like a handful, doesn't matter. But the number of 2 decks sold is just absolutely annihilating. Aether Drift, Edge of Eternities, obviously Final Fantasy's a little apples to oranges, but we are 2 weeks from regular release still. And this has sold through, in my best estimation, 85,000 copies. So if we are Aether Drift, Edge, 110, 105, obviously there's going to be some of these in Amazon that are sitting, some of these warehouses. Say Aether Drift and Edge are 150,000. Lorwyn is probably going to get close to that number shortly after release. So they're going to have to reprint Lorwyn again. And they're probably going to have to reprint it again in Q2. Or the Commander decks are going to get so valuable because they're not going to be available anywhere. So part of why I wanted to do this was, for myself, I wanted to see, because obviously we've seen some astronomical sales numbers for the 2 decks for Lorwyn selling on TCG Player, especially after spoilers came out. I wanted to take a look and see how this compares to the prior sets. And it's just batshit crazy. I mean, 4,300 equivalent versus 55 versus 52 for a set that hasn't released yet versus Aether Drift, which has been out for a year, just about. Edge has been out for 6 months at this point. Lorwyn's crushing it, man. It really is. And look, there's going to be a ton of singles on the market, and the singles are they're going to get smashed in value for the time being. But I would anticipate there's going to be a sizable gap here where the Commander market for these is going to dry up, at least on the sealed side. And we'll see if the value, the sell-through of the singles really keeps up, because if the sell-through of the singles starts to crush these numbers, then all bets are off. This is going to be an absolute home run. And again, the decks are good. The set looks like it's going to be a lot of fun. And there's just so much pent-up demand for Commander decks because we haven't gotten any since August. And that's the fact of where we're at. So anyway, guys, hopefully this was interesting. Again, feel free to comment on some of the assumptions. Don't really nitpick because I don't care that much. These are just relative swaths. And if the assumptions for all the sets are the same, we're either off by the same magnitude or we're correct by the same magnitude. It doesn't really matter. But let me know. So anyway, guys, have a good Saturday night. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, join the Discord, and have a good one.